Umbrella is one of the greatest villains in video game history. Umbrella was great because it represented everything Resident Evil stood for: ambition and control. But as great as Umbrella is, I started getting the feeling that Capcom is obsessed with Umbrella. Like, I don't know if that's just me, but it feels like that every villain, every virus, every new threat has to have some type of connection to Umbrella. The more they do this, the more they weaken Umbrella's story. Umbrella is the best antagonist in Resident Evil history, but its time is over. Its story has ended, and Capcom need to let the story stay the way it is without adding these cheap connections, ruining the story that we already have. In this video, I want to talk about why Umbrella was such a great antagonist, and also I'm going to explain why Umbrella doesn't have a place in Resident Evil anymore. Umbrella was the greatest Resident Evil antagonist, not just because they were powerful, but also because they represented the very things Resident Evil was built on. Resident Evil 1, 2, 3 were survival horrors, and one of the things that made it so successful was the feeling of being trapped and alone. Umbrella was great because they were that trap. They isolated Leon, Jill, Chris, and Claire in their system, their game. They always felt small because they were. Umbrella was huge and powerful. Leon, Jill, Claire, and Chris couldn't do anything to Umbrella, and this is best shown through Jill and Chris, who saw Umbrella for what it was months before the raccoon incident, but they couldn't stop the raccoon incident from happening. The wheels was already set in motion. They couldn't make Umbrella lose power with the information they had. They couldn't even get people on their side. Umbrella was still as powerful as it ever was, even with that information that they had. But you know what that information did do? It isolated them, because it was like they were the only ones in the entire raccoon who was able to see Umbrella for what it was. And when they tried to open up an investigation in hopes of exposing Umbrella, they were stopped, because Umbrella corruption spreads deep into the raccoon system, deep into the government. And when they failed in opening up an investigation, they opened up their own investigation. But the information that they gathered over those months didn't bring Umbrella closer to justice, and it didn't expose Umbrella any faster. Umbrella was almost always in control, and when they weren't, they covered it up. And there was nothing STARS could do about that, except survive in Umbrella's world. But survival was just enough to fight against Umbrella. Umbrella as a company felt like it always had to be in control, and when it wasn't, it covered it up. The raccoon incident, we get to see this firsthand. Umbrella lost complete control of everything. Everything was collapsing. Umbrella was exposed. Umbrella didn't try to fix the situation. They wanted to erase it. Umbrella began to send in their BOWs to kill all of the survivors, because if no one is alive, no one can really say what happened. Umbrella also collected combat data on these BOWs. I felt like this was Umbrella's way of trying to feel like they're still in control when they know they clearly weren't. And well, since this was a cleanup job, of course Umbrella had to also get rid of STARS, and so they sent the bioweapon, and its entire goal was to get rid of them. However, Umbrella didn't just create viruses, they were a virus of ambition. Umbrella trained all of its researchers to dream big, break boundaries, and I feel that each one of them knew that they weren't building a future, they were trying to control it. Every major figure in Umbrella had a corrupted ambition. Let's start with William Birkin. William Birkin was obsessed with his legacy. He would sacrifice anything to have his name remembered. And one of the things that was going to get that was the G virus, the thing that was going to have his name remembered forever. Alexia Ashford believed in genetic supremacy, not just in power, but in blood, bloodline, and divine right. She was chosen to lead the human race. Albert Wesker believing that he was the next step of human evolution. He felt that he was basically a god. He was untouchable. And just like Spencer, Albert Wesker wanted to be the one to lead humanity in the next step of becoming him. But once they become him, he would have to become more. These ambitions wasn't their strengths, it was their downfall. Because just like the company itself, they weren't building a new world, they were poisoning the old one. But the thing that's so funny, that ambition, that thought that all of them was made for something greater, played a major role in Umbrella's downfall. Umbrella was a system that was doomed to fail because it wasn't built on trust, It was built on ambition, competition, and betrayal. Umbrella was meant to fail the moment the founders discovered the progenitor virus, because Oswald E. Spencer, Edward Ashford, and James Marcus, they weren't friends, and it's hard to even call them business partners, because the moment the progenitor virus was discovered, they all tried to outdo the other person. Each of them had their own little projects on the progenitor virus. They didn't decide to do research together, because imagine if they did, they could have done some amazing shit if each of them worked together, because all of them were geniuses. And their ambition, their egos, is the reason that they weren't working together. Spencer believed that the human race was doomed, and he wanted to evolve them into a more superior race through a virus. And he was going to be the god of this new race he created. Edward Ashford wanted to preserve his family aristocratic bloodline. And while he and Spencer may have shared the same dream, unlike Spencer, who was self-made, Edward Ashford most likely believed it was his divine right because he was nobility. And Marcus only cared about feeding his ego through his research. That's why he saw no need to start a company. And even though during the time before Umbrella was founded, Spencer and Marcus were working together on the progenitor virus, they still were competing. But after Umbrella was founded, and after Edward Ashford's death, which his death was most likely caused by Spencer, a wider gap and a company that was just founded was formed. And this will lead to both Spencer and Marcus trying to take complete control of the company, and that will later lead to Marcus's death. We all know what happens after that. But after all of their deaths, after Spencer's death, after Marcus's death, and after Ashford's death, each of their ambitions carried on to someone else. William Birkin, basically the new Marcus. William Birkin was brilliant. He was also arrogant, and he was convinced that his genius made him untouchable. His obsession with the G virus was his way to feel like his name was going to be remembered forever. But the same as Marcus, William Birkin was betrayed by the company and his research was taken. Albert Wesker wanted to achieve the same thing Spencer did. He wanted to create a new race of humans, and he was going to be the god of that new race. But the same as Spencer, Albert Wesker flew too close to the sun, and so his downfall was inevitable. Alexia Ashford, basically the same as Edward Ashford, believing that it was her divine right to rule humanity because she was nobility. But the only thing she achieved was isolating herself in her own madness. And she shows us what could have happened to Edward Ashford if he wasn't infected with the progenitor virus. Each of them does the same thing. They were consumed by their ambition, and they were undone by their arrogance. But the problem wasn't that it was just the founders, or it was just these 3 other researchers. It was the entire company. Umbrella didn't just operate through ambition, it thrived on it. Every branch, every researcher believed that they were destined for something greater, and they all competed with each other. They hid secrets, they didn't share research, and if they did, it was usually because Spencer told them to. Literally no one in Umbrella American branch knew about the NEA parasite, and when they did find out, you really think Umbrella Europe was going to send them the parasite when they asked? Hell no. If William Birkin didn't have Spencer backing him, they wasn't gonna get that shit. And the entire Nemesis project was built on competition. Umbrella Europe was trying to prove that they can create an intelligent bioweapon, while the American branch is only focusing on strength. And they even failed at trying to make an intelligent bioweapon, like the stupid dumb Americans they were. And this wasn't even just the researchers, it was also the goddamn military forces. The USS and the UBCS both competed with each other. Perfect examples of this are literally Nikolai and Hunk. Both were rivals. Do you think they were friends? Hell no, I highly doubt that they were actually friends. I'm sure both of them hated each other, because one of them actually respected his man, while the other one saw them as just pawns. And when you think about it, I doubt anyone in the USS respected anyone in the UBCS, since the UBCS were literally just mercenaries. And because every researcher believed they were destined for something greater, of course betrayal was going to come from that. Some researchers sold data to rival companies, one of those being Albert Wesker and of course William Birkin. But it wasn't just them, and we don't get the name of some of these researchers, so I can't just name some people. And of course there were some people in Umbrella who just couldn't take the competition, the crimes, everything Umbrella was doing. So you had people like John Clemens, who was going to expose Umbrella with the data he collected. As an insider with insider data, I'm sure most people was going to believe him. And he is a great example for why Umbrella security is shit. Because if any leak happened, Umbrella was going to look at him first. If they didn't trust him that much, why the fuck didn't they get rid of him? But even then, many of these Umbrella rivals were able to infiltrate Umbrella. Just look at Ada Wong. She was a spy for one of these Umbrella rivals, and she was able to infiltrate Umbrella. And also, like I said, a lot of these researchers were selling data to other people, and Umbrella had no idea. They only find out once it's too late. We all know how arrogant Umbrella was, but their arrogance blinded them. Umbrella believed that they were untouchable. Every outbreak, every scandal was a temporary inconvenience. So that's why they mostly treated stars as an inconvenience and less of a threat. While yes, I did say that stars couldn't do much to Umbrella, I have to admit that that is kind of a lie. Because survivors talk. And when survivors talk, yeah, shit doesn't look well. And we also get to see this through John Clemens, who they themselves did not trust, but they still allow him to continue on working at the company. And all of this just shows just how arrogant Umbrella was and how that arrogance blinded them. The Arklay Laboratory, one of Umbrella's most important facilities, experienced an outbreak, but Umbrella completely abandoned it and just tried to pretend like it wasn't there. And the raccoon incident is a perfect example of Umbrella only start taking shit serious once it's too late. And as Umbrella slowly failed, Umbrella researchers began to leave the company. Some went to the black market selling Umbrella data there, and Umbrella slowly lost so much more because before they even noticed it, all of their competition had their data and had what they were offering. So what's the point of going to Umbrella anymore? And by the time the BSAA and even the government even made their moves on Umbrella, Umbrella was already hollowed out by then. And the only thing that was protecting Umbrella was Umbrella's government backing. They lost that the moment everyone had Umbrella's data, and even governments started getting it too. So there was no point for governments to be behind Umbrella anymore. And I forgot to even mention Alexia Ashford, the thing that no one in Umbrella was going to be prepared for. Because unlike many of Umbrella researchers like William Birkin and Albert Wesker, who was just using Umbrella as a stepping stool, Alexia Ashford was already done with the company 15 years before the raccoon incident even happened. So if they even managed to get past the raccoon incident, they were going to have to deal with her, and they wasn't even prepared for her. There's just so much to Umbrella's downfall that I can make a full length video about it, and I just might in the future. Now, if we compare Umbrella to other antagonists in Resident Evil, we really get to see just how good Umbrella was. After Resident Evil 3, as the game leaned more into action, the antagonist stopped feeling more like a trap, a system the protagonists were stuck in, and more like the traditional boss fight. Let's take the Los Illuminados quote in Resident Evil 4. They were a solid antagonist, and they almost captured that feeling of being trapped in their system. But the Los Illuminados didn't have the complexity Umbrella had, especially when you look into the inside. Outside of Lewis, there was no internal conflict, and believe it or not, the Los Illuminados, although their goal was pretty fucking stupid, could have succeeded if Leon Kennedy wasn't sent to rescue the president's daughter. Because who else would have stopped them? Maybe Wesker could have became a threat later on, but as of now, he wasn't a threat. And honestly, they may have succeeded with replacing the world leaders with fucking parasites. While Sadler and his co weren't bad villains, they were actually great villains for Resident Evil 4. They just didn't have the complexity Umbrella had. When you look at Wesker in Resident Evil 5, it's kinda hard to separate him from Umbrella, because at this point, he's the last thing remaining from Umbrella. He was raised by their ideology, he was shaped by their ambition, and in the end, he died because of it. Because he was arrogant. Wesker believed that he was special, that no one can stop him, that he was destined to do this. So Chris was just something to laugh at as he attempted to stop you when you already know he can't. But that belief right there was the reason why Wesker lost. And when you think about it, that belief was also what Spencer taught him. And yes, unlike Umbrella, Wesker didn't have the global control that Umbrella had. It didn't feel like you was trapped in his system, but Wesker did have something else, and that is brute fucking strength. Like Albert Wesker can literally punch a world and make it go home crying. Chris was trying to be him when he punched that rock. But the fact that he was so arrogant was the reason that he lost. Then there's Tricell. Like, who the fuck is Tricell? When you really think about it, Tricell was that company that Wesker worked for. And before we even got to learn anything about that company, they were gone. So it's hard to even consider them an antagonist or a villain in Resident Evil, because by the time we get to see them, they gone. Sure, Excella was probably the only one in Trisell where we truly get to understand. But at the same time, Excella was Wesker's bitch, so she wasn't really working for Trisell, she was working for Wesker and with Resident Evil 6 and Neo Umbrella. Look, I haven't played Resident Evil 6 at all, so I don't know much about Neo Umbrella, but at the same time, what I do know about them is they weren't great. Because if they were anything like Derek C. Simmons, I can 100% tell you that Neo Umbrella was a shallow attempt to say, hey, do you remember Umbrella? Without truly understanding what Umbrella was. So it's hard to even consider Neo Umbrella a full antagonist, where for me, who hasn't played the game so you can know, feels like they were just an attempt to say, hey, remember Umbrella? Without even putting in the effort to try to write a good villain. Now, when we look at the antagonists of modern Resident Evil, they are different. They're great for their games, similar to the Los Illuminados code. It's great for its game. During Action Resident Evil, ambition still played a major role into all of the antagonists. With the changed themes, I talked about how modern Resident Evil themes changed in this video. As I mentioned in that video, the main themes in Resident Evil switched from ambition being a major player to family. Instead of control being important to the story and to the villains, identity became more important. And while trauma always existed in Resident Evil, it never played a role when it came to the antagonists. So the new antagonists, they match these changes perfectly. Let's take Evelyn. Evelyn isn't trying to take over the world, she just wants a family to love her, because she never known love, she never received it. And for many, that is a lot scarier than a mega corporation or cult trying to take over the world, because it's intimate, and Evelyn still managed to make us feel like we're stuck with her. And sure, it's not on the same level as Umbrella, where you feel like you're trapped in Umbrella's world. You still feel trapped with her. And the feeling is more like you feel trapped with the Bakers, but you get what I mean. However, I do want to admit, as great as Evelyn was for that game, she still didn't have the same presence as Umbrella. And personally, the Bakers felt a lot scarier than Evelyn as the main antagonist. Because at the end of the day, Evelyn was a little girl, and I feel like they played a little bit of a role for why I wasn't scared of her. I know that's not true for everybody, because I know a lot of people that are afraid of little girls, and I can't blame them, because little girls can be scary sometimes. But Evelyn was just not one of them for me. Then we have Miranda, another great antagonist from modern Resident Evil. Because her story is simple, she's a mother who lost her child and slowly lost her mind in hopes of trying to bring her child back. And while I have to admit that Miranda didn't really get that feeling of making me feel like I was trapped with her, because I was playing as Ethan and because she had Rose, you kind of feel obligated to stay. You kind of feel obligated to find your daughter. And just like every other villain, Miranda has problems. Like, the absurd level in Resident Evil 8 is just unbelievable. And unlike Evelyn, who had the Bakers that generally helped her feel a lot more horrifying, Miranda has Thick Vampire, Doll Lady, Fish Boy that no one likes, and Magneto. For me, they felt more like anime villains than actual horror villains. I don't know if that was just me who got that feeling from them. And even their introduction, it just feels off. It's like it was taken from Resident Evil 7 and how the Bakers were introduced without completely understanding why it was so horrifying to see the Bakers. These people just looked fucking cool when you saw them. They didn't look scary to me. But when comparing these villains to Umbrella, it is a little unfair, because Umbrella just felt so powerful, like you were inside of their system, and that feeling right there is what made them such a huge threat to Jill, Leon, Chris, and Claire. And that feeling is what made them great, and also the complexity of how they fail is another part that made them just so great. But there is something that most people seem to not talk about, and that's with the themes changing in Resident Evil, Umbrella doesn't have a place anymore. Capcom seem to not understand that. What do I mean by this? I'm sure you noticed that Capcom feels that every antagonist has to have some kind of connection to Umbrella, even if it doesn't add anything to the story. Let's start with Miranda. Miranda apparently taught Spencer, and she was the reason that he wanted to become a god. But when you think about it, this doesn't add anything to Miranda's story. If you can think of any way that this add to Miranda's of her being a grieving mother, please write it in the comments. In fact, it takes away from Spencer's story. It makes him into who apparently wasn't a self-made evil genius, just a fanboy. Didn't come up with the idea of wanting to become a god from his own ego and arrogance. It was just seeing Miranda gave him the idea. And then it brings questions that shouldn't exist. Like, if Spencer knew that the mode existed and it gave him the idea of wanting to become a god, then why didn't he use it to become a god? This is a question that just shouldn't exist. And yes, they give us a crappy excuse like the mode can't spread the same way a virus could. But you telling me Spencer, a fucking genius, can't genetically engineer the mode to spread like a virus? This is Resident Evil where a goddamn parasite can literally turn you into Magneto. But genetically engineering mode to spread like a virus? Oh, that's impossible. And these questions does something much worse. It makes Spencer's end less important. Spencer was once so proud. He believed that he was on top of the world and he was meant for something much greater. But Spencer died a pathetic, miserable old man trying to become immortal. And the only person he believed that could help him was Alex Wesker. But she took his funds and abandoned him. And he slowly lost all hope that he would ever be able to complete his plans. Everything Spencer did was for nothing. Now, adding a connection to Spencer in a mode kinda weakens that, because it's like if Spencer was grasping for immortality so much, why the fuck didn't he just go to that goddamn village, which is isolated from the rest of the world, and just sit there until he become like Miranda? He and Miranda was clearly buddies, writing letters to each other and everything. So yes, Capcom wanted to add this cheap connection to Umbrella so much that they weren't something that was much better than that shitty connection. Now let's get to the other cheap connection in modern Resident Evil, Evelyn. Evelyn was created by the Connections. And of course, according to Capcom, the Connections couldn't have been founded by just some random dude. They had to be founded by a former Umbrella researcher, that researcher being Brandon Bailey. If you watch this video, you know exactly how I feel about it. And I'm not about to go too deep into it. I'm just going to talk about how it ruined much better stories. Brandon was the only person who was loyal to Marcus. Spencer separated him from Marcus, and Spencer was even funnier the fact that he gave him a clearance level of 9. That means Spencer wasn't trying to make him know some things about the company, since the highest clearance level was 10. So that kinda shows you that, yeah, Spencer didn't trust this man. And after all of that, Spencer killed him, because Spencer had no use for him once Umbrella started falling. Brandon's story is important because it shows that Marcus wasn't alone when a company first started. It shows that Marcus had somebody in that company that was on his side, and Spencer separated those two. It shows that Spencer isolated Marcus, and it shows just how manipulative Spencer really is, and just how Spencer sees everyone as disposable, even someone who was there since the beginning. We have Edward Ashford's story and we have Marcus's story that shows this too, but this story also shows you Spencer's views on loyalty, especially when you're loyal to someone other than him. And I feel that Spencer only kept Brandon alive to continue to supply the other Umbrella facilities with regenerative virus. But after Umbrella started falling and Spencer had no need for him anymore, Spencer got rid of him. But in Resident Evil fucking 8, they tell us that Brandon was Spencer's right hand man, and that he left the company after a fucking argument. Sure, it wasn't exactly an argument, but for me that's how I interpreted it. I interpreted it as an argument, but they ruined a better story just to add another cheap Umbrella connection. The Connections did not need an Umbrella connection. It could have just been a random fucking dude who started the goddamn thing. But no, they had to have an Umbrella connection, because every antagonist have to have one, because Capcom really does feel like Umbrella is Resident Evil, and it's not. And this obsession isn't anything new, because they've been doing this since Resident Evil 4. When we look at Lewis was an Umbrella researcher. Did he have to be an Umbrella researcher? No. Because when you think about it, he was the main researcher for the Los Illuminados code, and that's enough for Lewis' journey. You don't have to add that he worked for Umbrella too. That wasn't really needed. Sure, Resident Evil 4 make use of it better than the other games by making that be the way Albert Wesker found out about the code. But at the end of the day, that really wasn't needed. Resident Evil 5 gets sort of a pass because you're fighting Albert Wesker. He's literally the only thing left from Umbrella at this point. But then they say that Tricell was an Umbrella rival. Not that Umbrella rival though, another one. What did that serve? How did that sentence right there make Tricell more important? Tricell was not important to the game, and that sentence did not make it any more important. Then we have Resident Evil 6, Neo Umbrella. That's enough. That's all I'm saying about that one. But then there's one villain who I don't think had an Umbrella connection, and that's Morgan Lansdale. He works perfectly fine. In fact, he's a great villain. Makes you truly understand how corrupt people in the government can be. And if I remember right, they did not make him have a connection to Umbrella. Maybe they did. If they did, please tell me in the comments. And you also had Alex Wesker, who's Shasamus Wesker, who gets a pass because now she's the last remnant of Umbrella. Sure, when Resident Evil 5 came out, Wesker was the last remnant of Umbrella, but Alex Wesker then became that. And she was mentioned all the way back in Resident Evil 5. And when she came in Revelations 2, it was perfectly fine because she was mentioned and we had no idea what happened to that character. Unlike Brandon fucking Bailey, who was literally written down to have died. Umbrella is a great antagonist, and to me, the best antagonist Resident Evil has ever had. But it isn't Resident Evil. And Capcom needs to understand that. Resident Evil is a game that's already filled with enough inconsistencies. But the more they try to add these cheap connections to Umbrella, they create even more inconsistencies. Anyway, that's all I have for this video. As I said, Umbrella is the best villain in Resident Evil, and personally I'm all for it if they can manage to connect Umbrella to one of the antagonists and it makes sense. But even then, I'm still gonna feel like that connection did not have to exist, but they would have to make that connection important to the story somehow. Make the connection feel like it was deserved. Make it a part of the story, not just something to be there. And yes, if Capcom does this in Resident Evil 9, which I'm sure they are, I wouldn't mind. I would actually be really happy. Capcom has been recently proven that they don't even need the legacy protagonists anymore. The same as they don't have to be protagonists anymore, Capcom has to realize that Umbrella doesn't even have to be mentioned in the story anymore, especially if it's just fan service. Their presence was felt, and it's still being felt to this day, because we know if Umbrella didn't exist, Resident Evil wouldn't really happen. But the time is over. And stop trying to add these cheap fucking connections. Anyway, if you liked this video, you can give it a like. If you didn't, thank you for the watch time. My upload schedule is kinda shit right now, but I'm trying to make it better. And also, if you like anything horror game related, you can think about subscribing. The next video that's coming after this is that Bloodborne video, I think. So you should definitely be looking forward to that. And if you have anything you want me to cover, just write it in the comments. You know I'm pretty active down there. Anyway. You still here?